Which of the two major political parties is the most racist political party today? That's what I'm going to answer in this video. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to the Defiant Lawyers. I am one half of the Defiant Lawyers. My name is Augustus Corbett. I'm an attorney here in Dallas. And each and every week, we bring you at least one legal analysis of some trending story regarding politics, policies, personalities, or pop culture to empower you with the information you need to defy an unjust legal system and to nullify systemic racism. If that interests you, and I hope it does, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell so you'll get notification when we upload one of our videos. All right, so what I want to get into in this video is which political party is the most racist political party today? That's the question that I intend to answer in this particular video. All right, so we're going to get right into it. Let's jump right in. As always, I've prepared a lot of information for you. I've spent several days in preparation because I like to give you facts. I don't want to give you my opinion. I don't want to tell you what he said, she said, and all of that. Let me give you facts because a lot of folks comment on the channel with conclusory statements. Those are statements that just come to a conclusion without any supporting, corroborating information. And I, as an attorney, I don't do that. And as a minister, I don't do that. If I'm going to make a statement, if I'm going to make an assertion, I'm going to support it. I'm going to support it with the facts, with authority, meaning the law or the Bible or something. I'm going to support it. All right, so that's what I intend to do in this video. Now, I ask you to do one thing. If I've spent several days preparing for this video, I would really appreciate it if you would take the time to watch it from start to finish before you make comments. Now, I welcome your comments. I really appreciate you engaging with the channel, even if you don't agree with me. But oftentimes I can tell you did not watch the video before making your comments. And by the way, don't just watch this video. There are many others. So go and watch those videos and watch this video in its entirety, especially before making a comment. All right, so let's get into it. Which political party is the most racist today? Now, the purpose of this video is to provide some historical context to our current political and racial dynamics. We are in a campaign year, and there are many, many forces behind the scenes that are releasing all sorts of misinformation, all types of narratives to try to win votes, to try to deceive people, to try to get folks to vote for folks that are not in their best interest, basically. All right. So I want to provide a historical context, a racial context to the election that we have coming up. Most likely this election is going to be between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. It seems like those two men are the most likely candidates. Nikki Haley is still running, but her time is running out. All right. So it's going to be Trump and Biden. And a whole lot of stuff is being said about both guys, both of them. You know where I stand. I think Trump is a danger to the African-American community and to our nation. Some of you think Biden is an equal danger. I have made several videos to debunk that. This video should also do the very same thing. It should debunk the notion that Joe Biden and the Democratic Party and Donald Trump and the GOP or the Republican Party are moral equivalents. They are not moral equivalents. No way. Absolutely not. And I'm going to show you that so that, again, you'll know the difference between the real and some Russian bot or some right-wing group that's just trying to deceive people into supporting Trump. Now I'm going to talk about two things: Operation Dixie and the Southern Strategy. The Southern Strategy. So let's begin with the fact that the Democrat Party during Jim Crow was absolutely racist, full of segregationists, full of white supremacists, full of the KKK, full of enslavers, former enslavers, the descendants of enslavers. The Democrat Party, the Dixiecrats, were absolutely the most racist political party during Jim Crow. No question about that. That is undeniable. It's indisputable. At that same time, the Republican Party consisted primarily of white abolitionists and blacks, African Americans. And it was the party of Lincoln, the party again of abolitionists, the party of those who wanted equality for blacks. That was the GOP. That was the Republican Party. The operative word being was. That was the GOP. And what I described earlier, the Democrat Party, that was the Democrat Party. That is not the Democrat Party today. The Republican Party during Jim Crow did some really good things for African Americans. First, it fought in the Civil War against slavery. After slavery was abolished, it helped with 3 amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Every black should know what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments do. 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except for punishment of a crime. The 14th Amendment made us citizens. It gave us due process rights and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment states that our right to vote shall not be abridged. The 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments are extremely important for African Americans. But the Republican Party, during Reconstruction, radical Republicans as they were called, also gave us the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. And by the way, we use that statute today as attorneys when we sue police officers who have used excessive force on our clients. We use what is now Section 1983, 42 USC, Section 1983. We use that to sue those police officers and the police departments that hire them or employ them. So that all started with the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. The Republican Party during that time also elected some of the first black elected officials, and it remained dominant until the compromise between Southern states and Rutherford B. Hayes, who became the president of the United States. Essentially, the GOP, the Republican Party, agreed to give Southern states the South back if Southern states allowed Hayes to become president. All right, so they basically started turning on blacks, the GOP, way back then during Reconstruction, and that basically ended Reconstruction. And Reconstruction, by the way, is that period where, again, right after slavery, African Americans were empowered and became elected officials and helped pass some of these very laws that we use today and these amendments that still protect us as African Americans. After Reconstruction ended, a period called Redemption began, and a period we now know as Jim Crow started after Reconstruction. And that period of Jim Crow or Redemption lasted for about 80 years until the Civil Rights Movement began to dismantle those black code laws, those Jim Crow laws that white Southern politicians had erected immediately after slavery. So at this time, blacks were still primarily in the Republican Party. Now, during the 30s, a switch began to happen. Some blacks began to leave the Republican Party for the Democrat Party because of the New Deal. The New Deal was what Franklin Delano Roosevelt put in place in response to the Great Depression. It consisted of many different types of government programs that blacks desperately needed during the Great Depression. If whites were suffering during the Great Depression, can you imagine how badly blacks were suffering? What's the old saying? If white America catches a cold, black America catches the pneumonia. So black Americans were doing very, 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 very bad during the Great Depression. They were already doing bad because of segregation and sharecropping and blight code laws and convict leasing and all the rest of it. When the Great Depression hit, it got only worse. So quite naturally, many of them responded favorably to the New Deal by FDR. So some began to leave the Republican Party and began to go into the Democrat Party. Now, obviously, that began to create some angst by those whites who were in the Democrat Party, those Dixiecrats. All right. So this is in the 30s. So here's an illustration that shows that blacks started moving from the Republican Party over to the Democrat Party, and some whites began to move from the Democrat Party over to the Republican Party, again, right during the 30s. In 1948, something else occurred that also caused many blacks to begin to leave the Republican Party for the Democrat Party. In 1948, at the Democratic National Convention, Senator Hubert Humphrey, a Northern Democrat, pushed Democrats to fully embrace civil rights. Because although slavery had ended, we got to remember, when slavery was abolished, African Americans had nothing. And although slavery had been abolished, although the 14th and 15th Amendments had been added to the Constitution, still, blacks did not have full equality. We didn't get the 40 acres and a mule to start building wealth. We had nothing. Our ancestors had absolutely nothing and was facing another system, a Jim Crow system, that one author called slavery by another name. So we did not have full equality, free from slavery, but again, still having a very, very tough time as African-American people. Hubert Humphrey, a Democrat, pushed the Democrat Party in 1948 to embrace civil rights for blacks. Now, what do you think happened? Those Dixiecrats who were still in the Democrat Party began to get really uncomfortable. And more of them started leaving the Democrat Party, going into the Republican Party. And more African Americans started leaving the Republican Party and going into the Democrat Party. Humphrey said, "To those who say, my friends, to those who say that we are rushing this issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years too late. To those who say the civil rights program is an infringement on states' rights, I say this. The time has arrived in America for the Democrat Party to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights." That was a white Democrat Northerner who stood up boldly and told his Democratic colleagues that it was time to embrace full equality, civil rights for African Americans. Now, once again, that made a lot of Dixiecrats who were still a part of the Democrat Party in 1948, it made them very uncomfortable. And they started moving. They still didn't completely leave the Democrat Party, but movement had begun because they were absolutely, totally anti-civil rights, absolutely, totally anti-Black and anti-equal justice, full equality for African American people. All right, let's fast forward now a few years later to 1968, and the realignment or the switch had accelerated during the height of the civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement had already sort of began in 48, right? There was A.W. Phillips Randolph. There were others who were they weren't as visible as Dr. King and others, but they were really making some things happen again in the background. But things really picked up in the 50s during the Montgomery bus boycott. They picked up even more when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court. I always shout out the first Black Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, who was the lead attorney. He led the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund against segregation and was able to get an all-white Supreme Court to declare unanimously that segregation is inherently evil. I really applaud the late Justice Thurgood Marshall. But that case caused even more fear and anger in the Democrat Party by the Dixiecrats. And so now they are really doing everything they can to get out of the Democratic Party so that they could oppose, they could stop any civil rights legislation from being passed, because they were trying to obviously protect their white way of life. They had these white privileges and white power for all these centuries and decades, and they were determined not to give that up. And again, those people primarily existed in the Democratic Party. So they were not wanting to give up segregation. They were not wanting to give up white power, white privileges. They fought tooth and nail. And when the Brown versus Board of Education case was handed down unanimously, that really sent shockwaves through the South. All right. All right, the 1960 presidential campaign between two men and two different ideologies. One civil rights, the other states' rights. John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was all about states' rights and white supremacy. John F. Kennedy was a supporter, although reluctantly at first, of civil rights. That was 1960. And there was this man, Strom Thurmond, who cut a deal with Nixon to win the South. So they basically strategized that the best way to win the South was to appeal to white Southern voters, white supremacists, the racists in the South. And that's what Nixon began to do. Nixon was a Republican. Again, most white Southerners were still in the Democrat Party, but Nixon was trying to bring them over. And Strom Thurmond, who was also a member of the Democrat Party at this time, was working with Nixon to get those Southern white supremacist, racist voters out of the Democrat Party over into the Republican Party. So Nixon talked about things like the war on drugs. Now, many of you have talked a lot about the 1994 crime bill, which was another version of the war on drugs. You have really criticized Joe Biden about the 1994 crime bill. And I have made my position very clear about the 1994 crime bill. And I've said, among other things, that blacks also supported that bill, that something had to be done. I was alive during the crack epidemic. Things had to be done. In fact, folks, black people were putting pressure on Democrats like Joe Biden to get something done because of all the death and destruction that the crack epidemic was causing in the black community. Now, in hindsight, we know that the 1994 crime bill exacerbated mass incarceration. But the point I'm making is it began with Richard Nixon. The war on drugs began with Richard Nixon, with the express purpose of hurting black Americans. Nixon knew that the war on drugs would hurt the black community specifically. That was not the intent of the 1994 crime bill. The intent of the 1994 crime bill, again, was to address the crack epidemic. Nonetheless, Nixon used the war on drugs because one of the things that was going on during this Southern strategy was, instead of using the words, the N-word, they would use coded words like war on drugs. Southerners knew exactly what that meant. And so these presidential candidates who were trying to woo white voters, they had learned not to use such hateful terms like that in public because the country was kind of wanting to see some change regarding civil rights. And so they knew they had to talk to Southerners in a way that Southerners understood, but not be blatantly racist about it. So Nixon used, among other things, the war on drugs. But he lost. He lost. John F. Kennedy won that race. Now, we know that Kennedy was assassinated in 63, I believe it was 63, and that was the year before another election year, 1964. So Lyndon Johnson ran against states' rights advocate Senator Barry Goldwater. And Senator Goldwater continued the Southern strategy with something his aides called Operation Dixie. And Barry Goldwater was a man from Arizona, I believe, who had somewhat supported civil rights. But his issue was when the federal government began to try to force the provisions of the Civil Rights Act, he took issue with that and voted it down. He voted against it. So Goldwater infamously said to Southern voters, Southern politicians, he said, quote, "We're not going to get the Negro vote as a block in 64 and 68, so we ought to go hunting where the ducks are, which means we need to go and reach out to white voters." The ducks he was talking about were white voters. He says, we're not going to get the black vote in 64 or 68, so let's go where white voters are. Let's reach out to them. Let's say the things they want to hear. Let's support the policies that those Southern white voters wanted. And what do they want to hear? Segregation, states' rights. They wanted to hear how he would protect that white Southern way of life. And Barry Goldwater delivered. He delivered in a big way to white Southern voters. So as a result of that, he attracted a lot of those white Southerners who, again, were a part of the Democratic Party, and he began to see them leave. He was an impetus for more and more and more of them leaving the Democratic Party and going into the Republican Party. And he was also the impetus for more blacks leaving the Republican Party, going into the Democratic Party, because it was obvious who was interested in supporting civil rights legislation. Now, some of you, I did a video where I said that the GOP is currently trying to dismantle civil rights legislation. They've already done so to the Voting Rights Act. Their target now is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And some of you have said, well, basically let it go, or I'm okay with that. You're saying that because you don't understand the importance of the Civil Rights Act to African Americans. That's the only reason you're saying that. This is not just about you being able to go and eat at a white restaurant. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 protect more than our ability to visit places called public accommodation, hotels, restaurants, etc. It also protects our employment. If some of you are working jobs at companies that are owned by whites, the reason why they just can't up and discriminate against you and fire you or so on is because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So before you jump up and say, I'm okay with it being gutted or repealed, I'm okay with that, educate yourself. Some of you have also said in response to that video that, well, that may be a good thing. If segregation is reimposed, if the Civil Rights Act is repealed or gutted, that may be a good thing because that'll make us build our own. Man, I've said so many times, and I am a strong, strong supporter of African American people having a strong Black economic base. But we don't have it yet. We don't have the wherewithal to feed ourselves, to clothe ourselves, to buy cars and so on. We're not there yet. Until then, we have the doggone right to go to a white bank, because white banks are also prohibited by civil rights legislation from discriminating against us. We sue people for banking discrimination. And it's why I know that if these laws are repealed or gutted, we would be in a world of trouble, while some of you are sitting out there saying, I'm okay with that. You're not okay with that. You just don't understand. You just don't understand. And man, I am doing everything I can to try to educate you. This is literally what I do every day. We sue people for civil rights violations based on laws that were passed during the civil rights movement and even post-slavery, during Reconstruction. If the GOP is able to gut those laws like they've already done the Voting Rights Act, I am telling you, life will be very different for African Americans. It'll be just like life was for our ancestors during Jim Crow. You don't want to go back to that. You don't want to go back to that. Yeah, but during Jim Crow, we had our own. We had our own this. We had our own that. I agree with you. We did. We had our own banks. We had our own insurance companies, etc. And I want us to have those things again, to be self-sufficient, independent, where our dollars, where our Black dollars are being circulated amongst us in our own businesses. But we don't have it yet. And what we need to do is start developing a plan where we can begin to see that in Black communities. And this time protect them from racist mobs who in the past would come into our communities and destroy our prosperous communities and neighborhoods. This time we need to protect ourselves from that. But I agree with you in the sense that, yes, we need that Black economic base. But until then, we need to be able to go to any bank, live in any community that we can afford to go, that we have the right to go just because we are American citizens. And we cannot sit back and say to the GOP, it's okay, go ahead and gut the Civil Rights Act, they've already gutted the Voting Rights Act. gut the Fair Housing Act. No. Or to gut 42 U.S.C. 1983, Section 1983, that gives us the ability to hold police accountable, or 42 U.S.C. Section 1981 that gives us the right to hold banks accountable. We don't need to stand back out of ignorance and say that's okay if they gut those things. And the GOP is working hard to gut that stuff. So listen to me as I'm sharing this information. I'm not sharing this information because I'm a Democrat. I am not a Democrat. I'm not sharing this information because I'm a Republican. I'm not a Republican. I'm an independent voter. I'm an African-American man who is concerned about the African-American community. I'm concerned about my grandchildren. I'm concerned about my great-grandchildren. I will not sit back with the knowledge that I have and not speak out and speak up. So back to the Southern strategy that was employed by white Southerners to fight the civil rights movement. So Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater ran against each other in '64 after Kennedy's assassination. We just read that Barry Goldwater said, essentially, let's not go after the Negro vote, the black vote, but let's go after white votes. And he got a great response from white supremacists. Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, said, quote, "It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too." He's talking to Southerners, but obviously it's falling on a deaf ear, right? He goes on to say, because it is not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome. Now, Lyndon Johnson and the Democrat Party signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act. So when you hear blacks say that Democrats have done nothing for blacks, they don't know what they're talking about, or they're intentionally lying, because those laws are extremely important for us, as I just explained. So it is a flat out, total lie when anyone, any YouTuber or anyone else says the Democrats have done nothing for black people. And I'm scratching the surface. And I'm not saying this again because I'm a Democrat. As a matter of fact, there are many things about the Democratic Party I despise. But when it comes to race, when it comes to the issue of racial justice and civil rights, this current Democratic Party is the party that is fighting to protect the African American community. And this present Republican Party is the party that's doing everything possible to undermine civil rights, just like they did in the past. And when I say they, I'm talking about the people rather than the party. I want you to focus on the people, Southern white supremacists and racists who were one time in the Democrat Party, who are now in the Republican Party. So I want you not to get so caught up on the parties themselves, but the people who are in those parties who were, again, in the case of Southern Dixiecrats, they left the Democrat Party, I'm going to show you that, and they became members of the GOP. And that's the GOP that we're dealing with today. So Lyndon Johnson endorsed civil rights. As a result of that, more blacks came into the Democratic Party. and he won. Barry Goldwater lost, and I'm so glad he did. But Johnson knew, after he won that race, he knew that the Democratic Party had lost white Southern voters because they began to bolt out of the Democratic Party because now they're thinking the Democratic Party has embraced this civil rights thing and has embraced voting rights and has embraced integration. And so this is an assault, an attack on our way of life down south. So they began to leave the Democratic Party over to the GOP, the Republican Party, where Strom Thurmond was by now, where Barry Goldwater already was, where Richard Nixon was, these blatant white supremacists, blatant white supremacists. And by the way, Strom Thurmond, I don't know how many of you know him, but he was a South Carolina senator, had a black daughter, had a daughter with a black woman, as racist as he was. I love what I heard Reverend Jesse Jackson say one day. A lot of those segregationists were segregationists by day and integrationists by night. You know what I'm saying? The 1968 presidential campaign was won by Richard Nixon. This man to, I guess it would be to your left, to my right here, this man, George Wallace, was a blatant segregationist. States' rights. And by the way, if you don't know what states' rights is, states' rights essentially says the federal government should not have the right and doesn't have the authority to tell states what to do. So if states want to enslave blacks, they ought to be able to do it. If states want to enact black code laws to segregate blacks, they ought to be able to do it. Whatever states want to do, if they pass the laws, they should be able to do it. Put us at the back of the bus, forbid us from doing this or that, doing business here or there, going here or there. According to white Southerners, white supremacists, they should have the authority to do so. That was what George Wallace and Richard Nixon and Barry Goldwater and all the rest of them argued. And that was the plank and platform that they supported. This is, again, Hubert Humphrey, and he was for civil rights. Nixon won. That was 1968. 1972, 4 years later, Richard Nixon won the race against George McGovern. That was 1972. Again, he's still appealing to white Southern voters. The Southern strategy is in full swing. It is working. It is bringing those white supremacist voters out of the Democratic Party over into the Republican Party. That's why Richard Nixon was able to win that race. 4 years later, something happened. Despite the Southern strategy, Jimmy Carter won, a Democrat. And many Democrats began to think, well, have we stopped the bleeding? Have we stopped Southern whites from leaving the Democratic Party? Or more importantly, have we been able to convince Southern whites to vote Democratic, to not be so anti-black and so anti-civil rights? No, they had not. No, Jimmy Carter, his election was an anomaly. It was sort of a conundrum, if you will. It was unexpected, and it didn't last very long. Okay? That was 1976. I remember all of this. I was born in 62. I remember all of these elections. 1980, Ronald Reagan won the presidency. So, the Southern strategy had not faded. It was not defeated. And it gave Ronald Reagan, a white supremacist, the presidency. So the South was rising and rising fast. Southern white voters now had somebody other than somebody like Jimmy Carter who was willing to promote states' rights, promote white supremacy, promote racism in Ronald Wilson Reagan. I remember when he became president. It was concerning for a lot of us because we knew he was hostile to the civil rights movement. We knew it, just like we know Donald Trump is. So, Reagan was elected. Carter was not reelected. That was 1980. And here we are, 1984, and Reagan beat Walter Mondale. And that sealed the deal. That was it. Nearly all KKK, white supremacists, Southern white voters now had bolted from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Now, obviously, I am not suggesting that every white person in the Democratic Party is righteous and has no racism in their hearts. I said in the last video, actually, I've read many studies that show that most white people have some implicit bias. I'm not naive here. I'm from the South. I grew up in the South. And of course, not every white person is a racist. I always point out that there were white abolitionists during slavery who died to end slavery. There were whites during Reconstruction, Thaddeus Stevens and a long list of them, who fought for black equality. We saw Hubert Humphrey and a long list of them who have fought for blacks. Not every white person is racist. But I'm not suggesting that when those Dixiecrat white supremacists, Southern whites left the Democrat Party, that there were no white Democrats who had no racism in them. Not at all. I'm familiar with Robert Byrd, who was a member of the KKK, who stayed in the Democrat Party. I talked in my last video about the fact that Joe Biden took a stand on busing that I completely disagreed with. He worked with Jesse Helms, the late senator of my home state, North Carolina, who was a blatant, mean-spirited, hateful white supremacist. Joe Biden worked with him to stop forced busing. I know Biden's history, but Biden is no Jesse Helms. Biden is no Strom Thurmond. Biden is no Richard Nixon. And by the way, let me say that what is most concerning are not individual racists. It's systemic racism. It's structural racism. It's the racism that's in the systems. But of course, the Democratic Party is not void of racism. No one is suggesting that. But it is the party that has fought for civil rights now for decades. For decades. And the people who have fought against civil rights and black equality were Democrats, but now they're in the GOP, making it the most racist political party of all of them. Now, I want to recommend a book, The Long Southern Strategy by Angie Maxwell and Todd Shields. Great book. I recommend this book. It's a great book. All right. They say once the GOP was seen as the protector of the Southern sacraments of white privilege and patriarchy, many Southern white voters flocked to it, turning the South solidly red in 1984 for the first time in history. So it was a long strategy that started back in the 40s. It took 40-some years, but it paid off because in the mid-80s, the Republican Party was now no longer the party of Lincoln and freedom, and was no longer pro-black. It was now anti-black, anti-civil rights. That realignment, that switch occurred over a number of decades. But it continues 40 years later. The KKK, white supremacists, Trump, MAGA, Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys, Nazis, they're all a part of this day's GOP that is committed to white patriarchy, white male dominance, white male hegemony. It's committed to that. It is fighting for that. It is not fighting for black people. It is fighting against black people. It is fighting against the Civil Rights Act, against the Voting Rights Act. They have people on the U.S. Supreme Court. That was one of the things that Donald Trump did that is very troubling. And many of you don't realize it. He put a bunch of people on federal benches who hate the Brown versus Board of Education case. Donald Trump was given a list of these extreme right-wing judges by the Federalist Society, and he nominated from that list. And many of those people, again, their whole careers have been about being anti-civil rights, anti-black. He put a bunch of them on the benches. And that may not mean a thing to you until some police officer busts your head wide open or kill one of your loved ones, and you get an attorney to file a case on your behalf. And when you get to court, who's sitting on the bench? One of Trump appointees. One of Trump appointees. How do you think that judge is going to feel about you getting your head banged in by some police officer? And he or she has spent his whole life back in the blue and being anti-black and anti-civil rights. Your case is dismissed. We got to think, people. We got to think. We got to know what we're up against. Trump put hundreds of those kinds of judges on the bench. And by the way, he nominated maybe one or two blacks. Whereas Biden has put hundreds of people on the bench who are favorable to civil rights. What do you mean the Democrats and Biden have done nothing for black people? You don't know what you're talking about. You're literally spouting ignorance. You're literally spouting falsehoods that can be easily verified if you just do some research, rather than listening to someone on YouTube who, for whatever reason, is advising and counseling you to not vote for a Democrat because they take our vote for granted, or to get their attention, or to hurt them. And what's the result of that? Trump wins. Project 2025 wins. More of these right-wing judges, more anti-civil rights, more anti-blackness, because you listen to some YouTuber who, for whatever reason, I'm not going to speak about anybody's motive for saying these foolish things. And I do agree with the fact that we need to get everything we can from the Democratic Party and not allow them to take our vote for granted. But we don't cut off our nose to spite our face. In other words, I've seen some comments about I'm voting the couch until the Democrats do something about reparations. The Democrat Party has been sponsoring reparation legislation for 40 years. John Conyers, the late John Conyers, every Congress would sponsor reparations legislation. Here recently, Jamal Bowman did the same. Who blocks it? The GOP. So how is it that we're hurting the Democrats by voting the couch, which I take that to mean not voting, and Trump and his cabal of right-wing, racist, white supremacists take over the government again and implement more anti-blackness? How does that make sense? I'm going to say this. Whoever recommends doing that, if it's a black person, I can understand a white person doing it who's trying to get Trump in. I understand. They're just doing what they think they need to do to protect white supremacy. But a black person who says vote Trump or don't vote at all is either a grifter, a traitor, or an idiot. I'ma just say it. Someone who's profiting, being a part of that, or someone who is a flat out traitor to black people. I mean, what else can you say if someone tells you to do something that is going to empower the group of people who are trying to disempower you, who are trying to disenfranchise you? And they say support them or do nothing so that they can yet get in office and harm our communities. By 1996, 70% of U.S. senators from the South call themselves Republican, up from 0% in 1960. Today, it's nearly 100%, with the exception of the senators from Georgia. So this graph shows that in 1964, you see the black circle that's at the top of this graph. Those were the percent of white voters who voted Democrat. Here, 2016, the other end of that graph, you see how far that's dropped. So white Southern voters left the Democrat Party by and large and started voting for GOP folks because GOP people used that Southern strategy, said the things that they needed to say, gave those dog whistles. What type of dog whistles? Again, war on drugs. Reagan infamously used things like welfare queens, called black women welfare queens. Trump uses law and order. Let me tell you something. Back here during the George Floyd protests, that was all you heard coming from Trump. Law and order, law and order, law and order. Why was he saying that? He was saying that because he was being told to say that. Because that resonates with white Southern voters. And by the way, the South has reached all the way up now into the Midwest. Okay, by that I mean a lot of the voters now in some of those Midwestern states, Wyoming, Montana, etc., they too now vote like Southerners, right? Anti-civil rights, anti-black. But Trump was being told to use those kind of terms, law and order. When you hear that, it's usually when white politicians say that, GOP Republican politicians, they are sending a message to white voters that I'm going to stop all this protesting. And that is precisely what happened around the George Floyd protest. Governors like Ron DeSantis, Texas, Oklahoma, various states, many of them, like 30, 40 something of the states, began to pass anti-protest laws under the banner of law and order. Those are dog whistles to white, racist, white supremacists. Okay? Another graph that shows the percentage of whites who today identify as Democrat versus back in 1964. You see how that graph has just dropped exponentially. So the result of all of this Southern strategy, this Operation Dixie, is more and more and more blacks left the Republican Party as more and more and more white segregationists, racist, white supremacies entered the Republican Party. Now, to prove to you that these white segregationists, these white supremacists, used the Southern strategy, Operation Dixie, to reach out to white voters so that they could get the votes of white Southerners and consolidate those votes into a political bloc to stop the forward movement, the progress of civil rights legislation, black equality, etc. Here is Lee Atwater, the late Lee Atwater. He confirmed this. He said this in an interview. He said, quote, "You start out in 1954 by saying, by 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you. Backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this. Is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a blank, a lot more abstract. Now, who was Lee Atwater? He was a political Republican operative. He ran the campaign, for example, of the older Bush, and he ran other campaigns. He knows what he's talking about. He knows the strategies they use to talk to white Southern voters, to employ, to apply that Southern strategy without appearing overtly and blatantly racist. Although those of us who know better knew what he was saying when they talk about forced busing, states' rights. And once again, Joe Biden took the wrong position with forced busing. I've made that clear. But Biden is no Strom Thurmond. He's no Donald Trump. He's no Jesse Helms or Lee Atwater. Common sense tells you that. There's this term that I've been seeing, Jim Crow Joe. It is ridiculous on its face. Jim Crow is Strom Thurmond. Jim Crow is Lee Atwater. Jim Crow, Ronald Reagan. Jim Crow, Barry Goldwater. Jim Crow, Richard Nixon. Jim Crow, Donald Trump. Jim Crow, Steve Bannon. Jim Crow, Stephen Miller. That's not Joe Biden. The man who served 8 years under a black president. The man who has supported civil rights nearly all his professional career. The man who nominated a black woman to be his vice president. The man who's put many, many blacks on the federal bench. The man who's produced the lowest black unemployment numbers in American history. The man who is trying to get student loan debt decreased for black people. The man who wants to sign the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act into law. The man who's wanting to sign the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill into law. That is not Jim Crow. You don't know what Jim Crow is if you think that's Jim Crow. You have no idea what Jim Crow is if you think that record is Jim Crow. That's ridiculous. And here's more confirmation. Senator Lott confirmed the transition had occurred when he said this in 1984. He said the spirit of Jefferson Davis lives in the 1984 Republican platform. Senator Trent Lott of Mississippi, he was the majority leader of the Republican senators. He said in 1984, the spirit of Jefferson Davis lives in the 1984 Republican platform. This tells us who or what the GOP is today. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederate States of America, the traitorous group that fought the Civil War to keep black folks enslaved. He was the president. Had they won, he would have been their first president. Trent Lott in 1984 said the spirit of that racist white supremacist enslaver, he owned as many as 100 slaves, would have been the president. And Trent Lott said his spirit is in the Republican platform. 1984. Here's something he said on the Senate floor, just to show you how much of a racist this man is. And if it's his spirit in the Republican platform, again, that's the reason why I say the Republican Party, the current Republican Party, not the Republican Party that worked to free the slaves, but today is the most racist party in this country. Here's what he said. Mr. President, nothing but the form of civil government instituted for a class of people not fit to govern themselves. He was talking about slavery. So in other words, Mr. President, he was talking to the president of the Senate. He said, slavery is nothing but the form of civil government instituted for a class of people not fit to govern themselves. It is exactly what in every state exists in some form or other. It is just that kind of control which is extended in every northern state over its convicts, lunatics, its minors, its apprentices. It is but a form of civil government for those who by their nature are not fit to govern themselves. We recognize the fact of the inferiority stamped upon that race of men by the Creator. And from the cradle to the grave, our government as a civil institution marks that inferiority. In their subject independent state, they are not the objects of cruelty as they would be if left to the commission of crime, for which they should be incarcerated in penitentiaries and workhouses and put under hired overseers, having no interest in them and no relation to theft, no affiliation growing out of the associations of childhood in the tender care of age. According to Trent Lott, the GOP has that spirit in it. I'm going to say it again. According to Trent Lott, who was the Senate Majority Leader, he said that man's spirit, the word you just heard, was in the Republican platform of 1984. I'll say it again. It is the most racist political party in the country. And this shows how successful the Southern strategy has worked. All that red, that's GOP territory. That consists of territory of people who are anti-civil rights, anti-black. And they want to be in control of the government again under Trump. Now, I'm coming to a close. I want to look at the platforms, a couple of things about their respective platforms, both the Democratic platform and the Republican platform. Let me go to my iPad. This is the Democratic platform. It talks about healing the soul of America. Healing the soul of America means facing up to the deepest inequities in our society from structural racism. That is really important. That is really, really, really important that the Democrats acknowledge that there is structural racism in this country. The GOP will not acknowledge that. They deny that. They say there is racism, but they're talking about individual racism. Nikki Haley will not admit, Tim Scott will not admit, and this is something that I also hold against Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who both know that there's structural systemic racism in America. And yet they stood on camera and denied that America is racist. They probably did it for political reasons because they know better. From structural racism to misogyny to discrimination against people with disabilities and enacting ambitious measures to fix them. Protecting American civil rights. It's here. It's in their platform. Achieving racial justice and equity. Historic wrongs and abuses perpetrated against Native Americans, 2.5 centuries of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, and a history of exclusionary immigration policies have created profound and lasting inequities in income, wealth, education, employment, housing, environment equality, and health care for communities of color. That is specifically on the record acknowledging systemic racism. And yet you got some folks who say the Democrats are doing nothing for blacks. I wonder, what are they suggesting the alternative is this bastion of civil rights? Really? In fact, let's look at the GOP. Let me go to part of their platform that talks about civil rights. It's barely a paragraph, right there. And it's loaded with dog whistles. We affirm the Constitution's fundamental principles. Limited government, that's a dog whistle. Because, okay, small government is good in some instances, but in other instances, we need the government protecting the constitutional rights of Americans, especially African Americans and other minorities. Limited government is a dog whistle. Separation of powers, individual liberty, and the rule of law. The very group that we saw exhibit extreme lawlessness when they stormed the Capitol building. We denounce bigotry, racism, anti-Semitism, ethnic prejudice, and religious intolerance. We need to do more than denounce it. We need you to stop trying to destroy civil rights legislation. We need you to stop being anti-black. Just announcing it means nothing. Nothing. Therefore, we oppose discrimination based on race. When? When did you do that? When did you oppose it? When have you ever opposed it? Because you are the party. You consist of the people who were Dixiecrats, the segregationists, the white supremacists. And you left the Dixiecrat party, you left the Democrat party, and you went over to the GOP. And that's where you are now. You are the descendants of Jefferson Davis. You are the descendants of Robert E. Lee. You are the descendants of Strom Thurmond. You are the descendants of Jesse Helms. So when have you ever opposed racism? As the party of Abraham Lincoln, we must continue to foster solutions to America's difficult challenges when it comes to race relations today. That's so weak and you're no longer the party of Lincoln. We continue to encourage equality for all citizens and access to the American dream. What about systemic racism? What about racism in the banking system, the healthcare system, the education system, the criminal justice system? And when people are trying to do something about racism in those systems, you block it. Merit and hard work should determine advancement in our society. That is a dog whistle. That means anti-affirmative action, anti-diversity, anti-equity, anti-inclusion. And I am quite offended, quite honestly, when you talk about merit, because you've gotten nothing based on merit. You've gotten it all based on white supremacy. You've gotten it from the labor and land of other people. So, those are the party platforms of the Democratic and Republican parties. One is a paragraph, the other several pages. I wanted to show you that the GOP, the Republican Party, was once the party of Lincoln, the party that most black people were in immediately after slavery. And the people who were enslaving and wanting to keep slavery in practice and Jim Crow were a part of the Democrat Party, but they left the Democrat Party and went into the GOP, the Republican Party, because the Democrat Party was supporting civil rights. You got to know your history. Otherwise, you can be misled, misinformed, led astray, and deceived. It is not in our best interest as African American people to support a party that houses the spirit of the Confederacy, of Jefferson Davis. It is not in the best interest of African American people to support that type of political party. And that type of political party is not the moral equivalency of the Democratic Party based on the history, the recent history, not back during slavery, but the recent history, at least the last 100 years of the Democratic Party. They have been supporting and fighting for civil rights. Why would we support the party that was fighting against civil rights and still is? A party that, again, has the spirit of the Confederacy in it, according to Trent Lott. And he ought to know. Lifelong Republican, rose to the heights of the Republican Party, became the Senate Majority Leader. Hopefully this helps you understand that some of this garbage that's being put out is coming from a bad place. Some of these people are traitors, grifters, or just insane. I am Attorney Augustus Corbett. Thank you for tuning in. We are the Defiant Lawyers. We're going to bring you this kind of content from here out. We just want to set the record straight, shoot straight, talk straight, because we love the African American community just that much. We're fighting, we're in the court system fighting every day on your behalf. Again, thank you for tuning in. You have a good one. Peace.